Okay, so what we are up to is discussing the building of the second temple that we sort of started and stopped as we look at it from different angles. And again, each time we really want to understand what happened there. So we have the first time, so for almost 70 years, in the end, of course, it was for 70 years, the Jews were in an exile in Babylonia. At a certain point into the exile, where we still had quite a number of years still to go for the 70 years, the king of the empire, which is at that time the Persian Median Empire, his name, as we said, was Cyrus, historically referred to as Cyrus the Great, and he said to the Jews, go up. Go up. God put me in this position of power to serve him, to build for him a home, to build a home for God. Go up. At that time, when Cyrus granted permission for the Jews to go back to Israel and rebuild the temple, we said about 42,000 Jews went back. Now, that's quite a large number, 42,000. At the same time, of course, that means the high majority of the Jews didn't leave Babylonia, because it's ultimately not a significant number if we think of world Jewry. So again, it was a lot of people that were really very committed, because they were going from a garden from Babylonia at that time that was very comfortable. We said they were farmers, they had plantations, they were doing quite well, and they were going to this poor and desolate country that had been basically abandoned for almost 70 years, that had just become a desert, that they really didn't have a means of earning an income, and that they had to contend with a lot of hostile neighbors. So it took a lot of self-sacrifice. It took a lot of sense of commitment to God to make them do that. Almost like I'm thinking of, the pioneers that went to Israel in our times, where they left perhaps a more comfortable existence in the Western world, and they said they're gonna make it in Israel, where, again, I don't know if now it's the same situation, thank God. I think there's a lot of things that have helped in Israel, so maybe it's not to that degree now, but definitely there was a lot of there was a lot that the people going to Israel moving had to contend with, that they wouldn't have had to contend with if they lived in America. Even nowadays, you could buy this nice, comfortable, big house in America, or you could be in a tiny apartment, amid many, many apartment buildings in most cities in Israel. So there is a certain degree of self-sacrifice, giving up not for everyone, of course, but for many people that go there, giving up their more physical comforts to live in Israel. And that's really what was going on in those days, but to an even much, much, much greater degree. Now, as we're going to explain today, there was a group of people that were in Israel already, even before the Jews were exiled. And those people we historically refer to as the Samaritans. Now, who were these people? Where did they come from? And why is this impinging on our history? Is, just 1 second. Is, if you remember, when we discussed how the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, were exiled by Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, and I explained then that it wasn't a per se anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic act. It wasn't that at all. The truth is, it was a sense of, this is the best ploy to be a world conqueror. I conquer, I uproot the people, I move them somewhere else. They're strangers till they get used to the environment and this and that. They're not going to rebel against me. So everywhere he went, he took peoples, he conquered, he took the people, and he uprooted them, put them somewhere else. And then he would take someone else and put them there. So when he conquered the northern part of Israel and exiled the 10 tribes, he obviously brought another group of people to settle on that land. I mean, he knew he has to settle it. This is his empire. And if he doesn't leave any people there, it'll just be a wasteland. So he brought people that were called the Kutim. And they came and they settled in this northern area. They didn't fill the whole land, but they settled in the main central part, which was near the main capital of the northern tribe, which was called Shomron, or in English it was called Samaria, from which we derive their name, in Hebrew the Shomronim, or in English the Sumerians. So these people called the Kutim, that their country was conquered by Sancherib, they got plopped in this land. Okay, a land, we'll start making it here. And then lions came and started attacking them. Lions that usually come, from the jungles of Africa and attack people in these countries, like, what's going on? They realized it was something very strange. So they did some research and they found out that actually they were in a holy land. And it's called the land of Israel. And God doesn't want people there that don't serve him. So they said, oops, we got a problem because we're living in this land. And if we don't serve God, he's setting the lions on us. What does it mean to serve God? I guess it sort of means to be Jewish. So this group of Kutim decided they were going to become Jews because it was that or the lions. So this is literal historical fact. So they, so to speak, took upon themselves Judaism purely to save themselves from the lions. Even though they took upon themselves Judaism, they didn't give up their pagan ways. They sort of made a blend of Judaism and their own idolatrous behaviors. Now, this is all happening in the north, while the kingdom in the south, the kingdom of Judah, is being taken over and ultimately conquered by Babylonia, and the Jews are exiled. The Jews are gone for a long time, 70 years. This gives these Kutim, who became called Sumerians because of the central city of Samaria, Shomron, time to really feel this land is ours. And when the first wave of Jews came back and they're rebuilding a temple, these Sumerians were like, uh-oh, we don't want the real Jews here. We're the Jews. We don't want them. Which also might have some modern implications. I'm sure we can connect the dots. So they thought, what are we going to do? How are we going to get rid of them? I mean, the king, Cyrus, likes them and he gave them permission to be here. We're going to have to infiltrate from within. So they came down from the north to the south to Judah, and they were like, oh, we're so happy, brothers. We're so happy you came back. Lie, but whatever. We're rebuilding the temple. Great. We're also Jews. We also want a temple. Let's rebuild it together. Now, the Jews at that time were led by a Jewish leader, the prince of the house of David. Remember, we said once David became king, that's it forever. So this, I don't know if you remember the name of the king who was exiled. It was the first wave of exiles of the Jewish people, Yehoiachin. But Yehoiachin, who was the second to last king of Judah and a direct descendant, of course, of Solomon, the son of David, he was the first wave of exiles. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had 3 waves of exiles. And the first wave was the king at that time, Yehoiachin, who only ruled for 3 months before he was exiled. And if you remember the concept, 1,000 of the most elite level of the Jewish society, the nobles, the Torah scholars. Remember, we said this was sort of God's kindness. These 1,000 people went into exile earlier. So when the mob of Jews came in, these people were already established. They could already make it easier for them. These were very noble people. They came from an illustrious background. So they were even more accepted by the Babylonian people. So Yehoiachin was the king. His grandson is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, again, the leader from the house of David at this time, he's leading these 42-some thousand Jews back home, back to Israel. So Zerubbabel is leading these 42,000 people. And right away, their first task was to rebuild the temple. That's more important than anything else. And right away, these Sumerians come down with their big smiles painted on. Oh, we're so happy you're back. Right, whatever, we're pretending. We're so happy you're back. Come, let's help you build the temple. And Zerubbabel, who is, of course, a very wise person, he right away was very suspicious. And he right away understood that it was a ploy. And he understood that if these Sumerians were allowed to be part of the process of rebuilding the temple, they were just doing it to somehow sabotage the efforts. And of course, they didn't want the Jews back, and they didn't want the temple rebuilt. So Zerubbabel said, no, You're not, you're not, we're, no. We're the Jews. We were exiled. We came back home. We are building our temple. Which of course infuriated the Sumerians, who thought they had this beautiful plot set up and they had nothing. So they went back home so mad. Now, as long as Cyrus was the king, there wasn't really anything they could do, because Cyrus very much was for the Jewish people. He truly felt he was given by God this power, literally in order to help the Jews, help uphold God's honor and rebuild the temple. So they couldn't do anything as long as Cyrus ruled. But I told you, in those days, kings came and went really fast. So after Cyrus, of course, before Cyrus, remember, there was a very great supporter of the Jews called Darius the First, who truly supported the Jews. Then there was Cyrus, who truly supported the Jews. And then there was Ahasuerus, who, as we know, was this rabid Jew hater. So the Sumerians waited. They knew they couldn't do anything with Cyrus on the throne, but they also knew these kings come and go. So when Cyrus was deposed and Ahasuerus took over, now they knew Ahasuerus anyway didn't want the Jews. He was just looking for an excuse. So the Sumerians sent a delegation to Ahasuerus, and they told him, oh, these Jews, you think they're building a temple as a religious service? It's all a plot. It's all a rebellion. It's all to break away from your control. You can, of course, do whatever you want, but we think it's rather dangerous for your kingship. And Ahasuerus, of course, thought it was also rather dangerous for his kingship. And therefore, Ahasuerus revoked the permission to build the temple. The Jews were still in Israel, 42-some thousand of them. Ahasuerus didn't ship them back to Babylonia. I mean, they were, people that had been free for 70 years. He wasn't treating them as slaves. They were freely allowed to live in Israel, but they couldn't rebuild the temple. He took away permission. And that went into the heart of these people, because these people had come to Israel for the purpose of building the temple. Why would they leave their comfortable homes in Babylonia to go back to this desert land? Because they had a vision, what we would call a vision of Mashiach, a vision of rebuilding a temple for God. And now Ahasuerus took that away. And Ahasuerus ruled for those times relatively quite long. Perhaps God kept him in power for a long time to have the full-fledged story of Purim. Ahasuerus ruled for 14 years. The story of Purim took place over 14 years. Ahasuerus ruled for 14 years. So it was 14 long years. Of course, we know interesting things are happening in Persia, but looking at it from the perspective of the Jews in Israel, it's 14 long years. Until Ahasuerus dies, which happens to be shortly after the story of Purim, literally in the same year. After Ahasuerus dies, his son Darius II, of course named after Darius I, who was considered such a great leader of the Persian-Median Empire, though he only ruled like a year, I think. So Darius II ascends to power, and he merits a revelation of God. How does he merit this? Because here Darius was not like a regular Gentile coarse leader. Darius's mother was actually Esther. Now, Darius did not view himself as Jewish, even though, of course, from a Jewish legal perspective, he was Jewish. But Darius did not view himself as Jewish. He viewed himself as Persian. He lived as a Persian king, and we don't see any continuation of, obviously, if he was a man, obviously his children obviously wouldn't be Jewish in any case. So there's no continuation of Jewish in the royal house of Persia, but he obviously had tremendous sympathy. He had a tremendous feeling for the Jewish people. And as such, he didn't do it the first day he took the throne, because obviously that you can't start doing big things the first day you take the throne. But 2 years after he took the throne, he gave the Jews permission to rebuild the temple. So again, we already have the Jews in Israel. They've been in Israel waiting now for 16 years. Because Ahasuerus revoked permission in the beginning of his reign. We have 14 years of his reign, which covered the entire story of Purim. Now we're 2 years into Darius's reign. And again, now Darius says, I give you with my blessings permission to rebuild the temple. He not only gave them permission, he also sent them things to help them. He sent various items to really support their work. Now, the interesting point is the year Darius gave the Jews permission to rebuild the temple was exactly 70 years from when the previous temple was destroyed. Remember Jeremiah, Yirmiyah's prophecy of 70 years that all the Gentile kings were worried over? We discussed Belshazzar, who miscounted the 70 years. He picked from the first exile, the first wave of exiles of Yehoiachin. Achashverosh miscounted the 70 years by quite a few, actually, if we consider it. This was God's calculation of the 70 years, from the point of destruction of the first temple to the point of rebuilding the second. Point to point, 70 years. Now, the temple was not built then. That was when Darius gave permission. It took them 4 years to rebuild the temple. Now, it's interesting. Nowadays, in our calendar, we're in the period we call the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks is from fast day to fast day. Those are the starting and end points of it. These fast days commemorate the destruction of the temple. Last Thursday was a fast day, the 17th of Tammuz, which is when in the time of the first temple, when the Babylonian soldiers finally breached the walls of Jerusalem, which we learned and discussed, and we said it was actually 2.5 years after the siege originally started. If you don't know the historical fact, you know they surrounded the walls the 10th of Tavis, they broke in the 17th of Tammuz, and you figure it was a half-a-year siege. It was a 2.5-year siege. That was the beginning of the 3 weeks, and it ends in about 3 weeks with the 9th of Av, which was the day of destruction of the temple, both the first one and 490 years later, the second. They both were destroyed on the same day, the 9th of Av. So during this time, it's actually very appropriate to learn the laws of the temple. And the reason we do that is because of a prophecy that a prophet of God received when he was in Babylonia. It's very unusual because we view that historically prophets can only receive prophecy in Israel. This was a known prophet, Ezekiel, known in the Hebrew as Yechezkel. He was in Babylonia, and God gave him prophecy in Babylonia, the only one that we have recorded in the Tanakh, in the books of the Bible, the Old Testament books of Bible, that received prophecy outside the land of Israel. Yechezkel. So what was his prophecy? He had a few prophecies. In this prophecy, God shows him a vision of the ultimate temple. What we would refer to now as the third. In those days, of course, they only had one, so they might have called it the second, or I don't know if they didn't know there was going to be 3. So the ultimate temple. And the ultimate temple was actually far larger, grander than the first temple. And Ezekiel, Yechezkel, is experiencing this vision of this temple. It's a beautiful, amazing vision. And then God says, okay, go tell my people about this temple. And Ezekiel, Yechezkel said, what? I can't give this over to the Jewish people. They'll be so devastated. They're in Babylonia, and they're going to hear all about the grandeur of the temple. First, get them back to Israel, and then we'll teach them the laws of the temple. And God said to Ezekiel, just because my children are in exile, my temple should also be destroyed. Go teach them about this temple, because when they learn about the temple, it's considered as if they're building it. So from that midrash, that was the midrash I just quoted, from that midrash we learn that when we learn about the temple, we are building the temple. So therefore, I'm going to give a law now about the temple that relates to the history we're discussing now. Remember, I just said it took 4 years for the Jews to build the temple. So when the Jews built the temple, there were laws. One law is you cannot build a temple at night. They built it from dawn, from the earliest point, what in Hebrew we call Los HaShachar, which is dawn, first daybreak. They built it until sundown, what's called in Hebrew Tzesa Kochavim. So all day long they built. Once it hit sundown, they did not build anymore. They did not build on Shabbos. They did not build on the holidays. Who built? Every adult that was capable, every man and every woman was expected to participate in the building. Remember, we got like 43-some thousand Jews here. They're all expected to participate. Maybe they're going to be craftspeople. Maybe they're going to tan the leathers. Maybe they're going to make the wool. But everyone is a doer. Everyone must participate. And that took 4 years. The only people exempt from participation were the children. Because it says the children, when they study Torah, it's very special to God. Because they're so pure. They have no sin. And we can't compare the breath of someone who learns Torah without sin to the breath of someone who learns Torah with sin, meaning us, adults. So therefore, for the men and the women, you could stop their Torah study. They should go build a temple for God. But the children, no, no, no. That's the breath untainted by sin. We don't want to stop that breath of Torah study. You know, keep the school in place. We want our children to learn Torah. So for 4 years, the children learned Torah, but the men and the women were busy building a temple. And finally, after 4 years, it was ready, which was an amazing, amazing thing. That was in the year 3412. And as I think I mentioned last week, on one hand, this temple was not as holy as the first temple. There were several items. We said the ark, they didn't have. The ark was hidden in the underground tunnels. We discussed that. It didn't come back up. The breastplate of the high priest, that they could ask it questions, and the stones, the letters would shine to give answers. They had a breastplate without any of that godly communication board abilities. So and from that perspective, it was less. On the other hand, it was larger. Physically, it was larger, bigger structure. And it lasted longer. The first temple lasted 410 years before its destruction. The second temple lasted 420 years. We could say, 410, 420, who cares? But it means an impact on our physical world. It means for an extra 10 years over the first one, people are safe. So therefore, we really are looking in this situation and saying, you know, this is really serious things going on here. This is very, very, very significant. And this was very significant here that we have 4 years to construct this magnificent edifice for God that doesn't have necessarily the same level of godliness as the first, but on the other hand, impacts the physical world more strongly. And we really compare the two temples from that perspective. We say the first temple lasted less and was smaller. The second temple lasted more and was greater, bigger. So from that perspective, it more impacts the physical. But the first temple was more holy because it had all these very holy items that we didn't find in the second. So the first temple is more holy. The second one more impacts the physical. And the third will have both advantages, plus beyond. It will be as holy and actually beyond as the first. And it will impact the physical and much more than the second. And that will be the vision, reality of the third temple that's coming from the sweat and the efforts of the first two. Now, again, when these Jews are building their temple here for 4 years with absolute self-sacrifice, they're not thinking, okay, this is the second one. This is really good to know about the second because it's going to be an awful long time until we get the third. No, they didn't know there was going to be a third. They didn't know there was a second one was going to be destroyed. To them, again, it was this temple and our relationship with God forever. That was literally the concept, forever. When they were building it, they spent 4 years to build a piece of forever. We know it wasn't forever. We know it lasted 420 years. We know all the breakdowns the Second Temple era had. But they didn't know any of that. So they were, by definition, really hopeful as they went that journey to Jerusalem that this time, it would work. So that's what happened. Now here we have the Jews. They spend 4 years. They build this temple. But that doesn't mean the Jews were on a high level then. They actually really weren't. And therefore, God sent another leader to help inspire the Jews and bring them back to God. You know, we see this as God's pattern, that he's always going to send a Jewish leader. He's going to send someone to bring us back to God. So a true Jewish leader went with them. Zerubbabel was a true Jewish leader, and he was the prince of the house of David. But they've been in Israel already a long time. This is now already, they've been 20 years in Israel. Remember, we had 14 years of Ahasuerus's reign. We had 2 years of Darius till he gave permission. We had 4 years till they finished the construction. So at this point, the Jews have been in Israel over 20 years. It was a long journey. It's a tiring road. They're just barely making anything to make sure that everything is as it must be. So God knew at this point, we need another leader. You know, it's interesting. There's a story. I'm not going to say the whole story because it's quite long. But I'm reminded here of a story in our generation of an Israeli couple that knew about zero of Judaism. And they were in Tasmania. The husband was studying in the university there. And they come to Tasmania. There's this tiny little synagogue of maybe 8.5, 9 old men. And they're an Israeli couple. That means they speak Hebrew. Wow, they could have already been the rabbi of the synagogue. And the synagogue was so happy, Jews and young Jews. And they got them. They said, come, you know, be our cantor, read the Torah for us. This guy, he's off of kibbutz, he knows nothing from nothing, but I mean, he can read Hebrew. So, and he's a nice guy, and he feels bad for them. So, okay, he becomes the cantor. He becomes the one that reads the Torah, whatever. And somehow that sort of opened the door to this couple and God. And the couple started feeling more and more of the reality of God. And they wanted to connect to him. This was quite a while ago, way before internet, let alone, you know, Google anything and WhatsApp anything. And so they were in Tasmania. You know, they could have been on the moon. They were so far from anything. And they really wanted to connect to God and to find out how he wants them to serve him. But they have no clue. I mean, they're in Tasmania. And somehow they got their hands, maybe in the synagogue, there was a Tanakh, you know, the Jewish scrolls, the 24 books of Torah. And they started reading them. And the wife especially, she read them very, very seriously. And she saw a certain pattern. And the pattern she saw, which is the pattern I'm talking about, which is what reminded me of the story, the pattern she saw is God always sends a savior. There's always some human out there who's representing God on planet Earth and who helps the Jews come back to God. So she knew it must be true now because it was true throughout all these 24 books of Tanakh. So she started praying and she said, you know, I don't know what your name is. I don't know where you are, but we're in Tasmania and we want to serve God and we know nothing. Please come and help us. This was her like love notes that she was sending up to God. And one day, her husband's walking the streets in Tasmania, and he sees an Orthodox Jew, a man with a fedora hat and a beard, and clearly an Orthodox Jew. He runs over to him. He's so excited. He grabs him. He brings him to the house. They spend the entire night talking. They ask numerous questions. They take perfect notes. How do you do this as a Jew? How do you do this as a Jew? How do you? And he spent just hours downloading, talking about Shabbos and kosher and family purity, everything. It was really literally the morning when he left, and they were like, now we know. Now we know how to be a Jew. And they were like, wait, we didn't even ask him his name. We forgot about that. Anyway, the couple continued. The couple actually truly committed to being absolutely, completely religious, and they realized they could no longer stay in Tasmania. So they moved to Australia. He actually became a professor. He got a job as a professor in a university in Sydney. And just to fast forward to conclude the story, one day, this woman, her name was Hasofer, Mrs. Hasofer, she was sitting with a friend of hers. I don't remember the lady's first name, but her last name was Gutnick. And they were talking, and she happened to mention that they used to live in Tasmania for many years. And the woman said, really, Tasmania? Oh, that reminds me of such a crazy story my father once had. My father, you know, Rabbi Gutnick, he's a big Chabad rabbi in Melbourne. And, you know, once the Rebbe sent him on a really unusual mission. He just said, go to Tasmania. Okay, Rabbi Gutnick doesn't know why, but he goes. And he's walking the streets, and some crazy guy grabs him and pulls him into his home And my father spent the whole night teaching this couple all about Judaism, and that was it. He left the next morning, never saw them again, goes back to Melbourne. Really weird story. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hasofer is like, what? What happened? Tell me that again? Who sent your father? Oh, you know, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. We're Chabad. Lubavitcher Rebbe sent my father. She said, we were that couple. That was me. That was my husband. Who sent you, Rabbi Goodnick? The Lubavitcher Rebbe. She goes home. She tells her husband the story. And it's like, oh. I was sitting in Tasmania in my living room crying out, whoever you are, I know there's someone there. Please help us. And Lubavitcher Rebbe must have heard those prayers. And he sent Rabbi Goodnick to teach us. This story continues. I'm not going to say it more because that was basically the point. That always in every generation, God makes sure there's someone for the Jewish people. So when the Jews first went to Israel, when Cyrus gave permission, some 20 years before, the young, relatively young, energetic leader of the Jews, Zerubbabel, led the Jews. That was 20 years later. The Jews have built the temple, but the Jews are not on a high level. Economically, it's poor. A lot of them are ignorant. Some even intermarried with the nations around them. There was a lot of aggression, actually, from the surrounding nations. Nobody was happy the Jews were there. The Jews were living a very hard life, a very poor life, and they seriously sank much from the spiritual level they had been holding at 20 years before. So God sent another leader, and his name was Ezra. Ezra was the next leader in this beautiful chain that God always sends someone for us. Ezra was such a high-level person that our sages say about him, if Moses, listen to these words of our sages, if Moses had not preceded him, God would have given the Torah to the Jewish people through Ezra. That's how great Ezra truly was. He was a strong leader. He was a charismatic leader. And he knew the settlement in Israel needed an infusion of fresh blood, as we say. So he really tried to get more Jews to go with him to Israel. But nobody wanted to go. People didn't want to go because it was hard. It was hard to go there. It was a hard land. It was a poor land. It was not such a safe land. There were a lot of neighboring Arabs that were very unhappy with the Jewish settlement. In the end, with all of Ezra's charisma, all of Ezra's strength, only about 1,500 Jews went. Let's compare this. 20 years before, when Cyrus gives permission and everyone's like all excited and inspired, it was still a very small percentage. But that very small percentage did mean 42,000 Jews. Now, when Ezra's going back and trying to restart the community and give it a new birth of life, he only has 1,500 Jews that are willing to go with him. Such a degree that it was to such a degree that actually, sorry, doing something here. To such a degree that actually not one Levite went with Ezra. Ezra's like, what? You guys, you're supposed to be the spiritual people. You're supposed to be the ones that are going to help with the temple. I mean, not the priests, but you're like the helpers. Not one Levite went. Ezra said, that's crazy. And he punished the Levites. I mean, he made a decree in terms of the tithe, that the farmers are supposed to give a tithe of their crops to the Levites. Either he changed the decree that they could give it to the Levites or the priests, or he changed the decree because even in the beginning they could give it to the Levites or the priests and they could only give it to the priests. But Ezra said this literally as like a, what? You're the Levites. You're the ones that are supposed to be leading the Jews in holiness. And what's holier than going back to Israel? And you're not going up. So we can see from the beginning that Ezra found it very hard when he came to Israel. There was intermarriage, not much, but there was some intermarriage. There wasn't so much intermarriage because the nations surrounding the Jews were pretty hostile to the Jews. So there weren't that much intermarriage. But there was some intermarriage. There was tremendous ignorance. There was breaking of a lot of the laws, some knowingly and some unknowingly. So there was a lot of poverty. It wasn't a fun scene when he got there. It was pretty, like, probably depressing for him to realize his challenges. But he had a lot of energy. He had a lot of strength. He knew he was representing God. First thing he did, from everything I said, what do you think would be the first thing he would attack? What do you think would be probably the most significant thing he has to work on?
Schools, children.
That would make a lot of sense. But if you think of all the problems I said, what would be the biggest problem from the list I just rattled off?
To divorce intermarried couples?
Exactly. That was the first goal of Ezra. There weren't so many intermarried couples because, again, as I'm saying, the nations were pretty hostile. But there were some because the people had fallen over these 20 years. So the first push of Ezra was to divorce, to separate these intermarried couples. And that was his first target. And he had 100% success, meaning couple by couple. The couples generally meant Jewish men that had taken non-Jewish women. And they all separated from these non-Jewish women. They all left them. And this was his first goal, because if we're continuing the Jewish people, we got to make sure we have the Jewish people here. So that was his first point of, like, what he had to deal with. Then Chava sort of was correct, because Chava was basically saying she was looking at it as children, but he looked at it on all levels, education. So the first goal was stop the intermarriage, stop every such relationship. The second goal was education. We have to teach the people. They're ignorant. Yes, they're doing many things wrong, but there's just so much ignorance. So he really started campaigning on both for the children and for the adults, teaching a lot of Torah, that the people got the education, the knowledge of what it means to live as a Jew. Because then if they have the knowledge, then we can hope they could do it. We got to start with that point of knowledge. Ezra made 10 enactments that were really designed to both improve the spiritual life of the Jewish people and also improve the physical life of the Jewish people in those times. As I said, it was hard. Meaning on a spiritual level, for example, I don't know if you know, but how often do we read the Torah? Do you know on a regular week how often we read the Torah?
Monday and Thursday.
Excellent. Monday, Thursday, and Shabbos. Now, originally, the Torah was only read on Shabbos. Ezra said, no, it's too long a wait. The people can't hear the Torah only once a week. What's going to happen to the other 6 days of the week? We've got to put more Torah into their life. So he enacted, which of course we do till today, as all of his enactments we keep till today, that every Monday and every Thursday, we're going to read from the Torah. So a Jew will not go 3 days without hearing Torah, because you have Saturday, Sunday, then Monday hear it again, Tuesday, Wednesday, then Thursday hear it again, Friday, then Saturday hear it again. So we never have a space of 3 days without a Jew hearing Torah. Now, obviously, we'd like a Jew to learn Torah every single day, but at least 3 days shouldn't go by that a Jew shouldn't hear Torah. That was obviously a very spiritual decree. One maybe we can relate to more. He made another decree. The peddlers would go around to sell things to the women, like cosmetics, but they didn't go to the whole outlying areas. They would just pretty more be centered where the main group of the Jews were. And Ezra said, you have to go to all the settlements, because a woman should always feel that she's be able to buy something and feel good and feel pretty, feel good about herself. So the same way one of the enactments was that every Monday and Thursday, as well as Shabbos, we have to read the Torah. Another decree was the peddlers have to go to all the outlying settlements so that every woman has access to cosmetics, because that's also important. So Ezra really was trying on both levels to build up the Jewish people. He understood that he had to build them up spiritually, and he understood that he also had to build them up physically, because they were just in general feeling very, very down. It was hard. Like, imagine you're all inspired 20 years before, and you're this pioneer, you're young, you're full of energy. Well, now it's 20 years later, and it's been hard. So they were tired. They weren't feeling they built the temple, which was amazing, but they still weren't feeling so great about themselves and their accomplishments and their settlement. So both spiritually and even physically, Ezra was trying to build up the people. It's interesting, we mentioned this a few weeks ago when we spoke about Cyrus, that our sages say that when Cyrus said, God put me in this position so I can create this temple for him. Jews, go up. Whoever wants to go up, go up. And 42,300 some people went up. And our sages say, and I know I mentioned this before, it was such an amazing point to me, that if Cyrus himself had gone up, if Cyrus had said, I'm coming too, I want to build this temple for God, I don't just want to give you permission, I want to be a part of it, that would have brought the Mashiach. This Gentile would have brought the Mashiach if he committed to that degree to serving God, that he, the great king, was going to go up and build the temple too. So similarly, our sages say that when Ezra went around Babylonia trying to get these Jews that are very comfortable, and they have their night date farms, and they have their Torah study, and they give charity, and their lives are good, and he was saying, let's go to Israel. Israel needs you. And they're like, yeah, we send donations. He's like, no, Israel needs you. Your donations are good, but Israel needs you. And I told you not even one Levite went. And if all of his campaigning, he got 1,500 people to go with him. Our sages say this was another opportunity for the coming of Mashiach. That if the Jewish people had gone en masse, meaning the bulk of the Jews had gone up with Ezra to Israel, that would have been enough to bring Mashiach. Now again, it's not an easy thing, and we're not judging any of the people that didn't go, because we can totally relate. Actually, I think there's so much modern ripple, resonating waves from what happened then. To understand they were comfortable, they were settled, they weren't looking for hardship. So we understand why they didn't go. It was going to a very, very hard situation. And God says, I know that too, but guess what? Sometimes we make a choice for God. And we're making a choice for God. Sometimes it's harder. But guess what? It's for God. You're making a choice for God. So those 1,500 people that went with Ezra, maybe we're descended from them, they made a harder choice. And honestly, again, if we can envision that map of Babylonia and Israel, from this point, really from when Cyrus first sent those Jews, whoever wanted to go, now the Jewish settlement has split. We have the Jews in Israel. We have the majority of the Jews in Babylonia. From now, forever, until the Babylonian settlement gets destroyed, which is hundreds and hundreds of years from now, these are always the dynamics. The majority of the Jews are in Babylonia. Much smaller numbers in Israel. It's much easier in Babylonia. It's much harder in Israel. They're much richer in Babylonia. They're much poorer in Israel. Now, we know the history. We know, like, the story of Hanukkah. All those things happened in the Second Temple era with the minority of the Jewish people, because the majority of the Jewish people weren't in Israel. During the story of Hanukkah, the majority of the Jewish people were in Babylonia. The Second Temple gets destroyed. Again, the majority of the Jewish people aren't in Israel with the destruction of the Second Temple. They're in Babylonia. So we have, from this point, as I see it's too late for us to discuss today, but we will discuss next week, this split of the Jews to those people in Israel, leading a harder but trying to have a more spiritual life, and the Jews in what we call the diaspora, which was primarily in Babylonia, that had an easier life, but probably had to work much harder to maintain their spiritual stature, even though we see that they did, and there was a lot of Torah that came out of Babylonia, to be discussed much later. Now, I said God never abandons us, and he's always going to keep sending that Jewish leader to give us strength. So first we had Zerubbabel, right? And then we had Ezra. Probably about, Ezra went basically after the first temple was built. So about 10 years later, God sent another leader to help give energy to the settlement in Israel, which you see that God keeps trying to help us. Meaning, even though we feel so downtrodden, we feel it's so hard, we feel we're suffering, but God says, I love you, and I keep trying to make it work for you. So we had Zerubbabel, and then we're saying some 20 years later, we had Ezra, and then some 10 years after that, these dates are a little bit rough, but approximately, we have another tremendous Jewish leader who joins Ezra in Israel, and his name was Nehemiah. If you've ever heard Ezra and Nehemiah, people view them as like the dynamic duo, because they were really tremendous partners in working together to build up the Jewish community in Israel. So remember, Ezra had come and he was strong and he was charismatic and he broke up the relationships with the non-Jewish women and he started teaching people Torah and he made 10 enactments. He did a lot. But now it's 10 years later, we need more fresh blood, so to speak. So God sends Nehemiah. Nehemiah was actually given political power in Israel, meaning Ezra came as a spiritual leader. He was the Torah teacher of the Jews. Nehemiah was given by the Persian king of that time the political authority to be like governor over this area. So Nehemiah had a certain political power that made him able to do certain things that Ezra couldn't. Now, when he came, he also saw a mess. Remember, when Ezra came, Ezra saw a mess. When Nehemiah came, Nehemiah also saw a mess. He saw it was really bad. He saw the walls of the city. In those days, protection meant you had walls. If you didn't have walls, you were completely defenseless. So there were walls around Jerusalem. Those walls were destroyed. They were burnt down. The city was defenseless. It was open. So Nehemiah right away built up the walls. Now, for any of you who have been to Israel and you've been to Jerusalem and you've seen the walls around the old city of Jerusalem, those are not the walls we're talking about. A lot of people look at those walls and they mistakenly give them like more holiness than they have. Those walls were not built by Jews. Those walls were built by the Turks. Those walls were built by the Turks in the 1500s. So we're talking way, way, way before. But again, in those days, just like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, the Turks still needed walls to defend the city. So Nehemiah right away said, what? Jerusalem is without walls? Jerusalem is defenseless? And so right away, he got everyone moving to very, very quickly build up the walls of the city. The neighboring Gentiles, the Arabs, had burnt down the walls all around Jerusalem. He built the walls really quickly. In a few weeks, he built up those walls. And he saw, so that was like something he did to protect them physically, just as Ezra make sure we learn the Torah Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, and make sure the women have cosmetics, because we got to help people on both fronts. It's not enough just to be spiritual or just to be physical. We're humans. We need both. So the same thing here with Nehemiah. He comes, and first he's like, oh my gosh, where are the walls to defend Jerusalem? So he right away quickly gets people to build those walls. In a few weeks, he built walls around the entire city. That was helping them physically. And at the same time, right away, he saw a lot of spiritual breaches. Jerusalem was a breached city because there were no walls. And spiritually, it was breached because the people were very ignorant still, even after everything Ezra did. And there was a lot of violation of law. For example, something that he found really appalling that the people were doing at that time is they were doing the commercial activity on the Sabbath. And they thought they were okay. Why did they think they were okay? Because they said, listen, we're not allowed to write on the Sabbath. We're not writing. As long as we don't write, what's the problem? What are we violating? What law are we breaking, Ezra, Nehemiah? What are we doing wrong? So Nehemiah tried to explain to them that there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law. That for you to be engaging in commerce on the Sabbath is not what God wants you to do on his day of rest. But we're not breaking any laws. So Nehemiah said, oh, really? Well, let's change the laws a little. Let's add protections to the laws. And he instituted something which we keep till today, and which is very part of every person that keeps the Sabbath, which is all the laws of muktzah, right? Muktzah means that you cannot move an item whose use is forbidden on the Sabbath. That's a long sentence. That's a really simple concept. For example, money. What's the word? Money is a piece of paper. Why can't I touch it? Why can't I put it through my fingers? Why can't I count it? I can't buy with it.
Right.
Someone's talking on the phone now. If you could mute yourself so we don't hear.
Oh, Linda, hold on. Yeah, fine. How are you?
Just
Yeah.
one second. Let me do that.
What's actually wrong with you? I didn't.
Just one second. Okay. So the Jews say, why can't I hold money? I'm not going to buy anything with it. Why can't I hold it? Because the Nehemiah said, once you're holding the money, the next step is you're going to go use it. I mean, they didn't have pens in those days, but we have pens, so we'll take a pen. What's the problem with picking up a pen? Because once you pick it up in your hands, you're going to write with it. So the concept of muktzah is to give us protections. Don't touch, don't move the money so you won't come to use it. Don't move the pen so you won't come to write. Who instituted this? Nehemiah. Why? So this is in our lives until today. Any person who keeps the Sabbath is full of the laws of muktzah. This all goes back to Nehemiah. And why did Nehemiah do this? Because that's exactly what he saw in his days. That the people were like, why can't we engage in commerce as long as we don't break any of the laws? We can't skirt around all the laws because muktzah didn't exist yet. And Nehemiah said, no, you can't. Because if you're engaging in commerce on the Sabbath, you're not really keeping the Sabbath. You're desecrating the soul of Sabbath. You're not keeping the heart of Sabbath. So therefore, we're going to create protections. We're going to call it muktzah. And you're not going to be able to move any of these items. And then you won't be able to do any of this stuff on the Sabbath that is violating the spirit of the Sabbath. So again, Nehemiah is helping the body of the Jews. Right away, he builds those walls. Nehemiah is helping the soul of the Jews. Right away, he institutes all of these laws to protect the sanctity of the Sabbath, just like Ezra, the cosmetics and the Torah reading, Nehemiah, the walls and the laws to protect the Sabbath. And again, both of their injunctions. We still learn Torah. We still read the Torah on Monday, Thursdays, and Sabbath until today. We still have all the laws of muktzah in place until today. So these people lived and served God thousands of years ago. And until today, what they're doing exists as a living testimony of what it means for a Jew to serve God. Which shows you that when you're doing something and you're so sincere and you're so committed and you're so connected to God, and you can think, oh, what am I accomplishing? You know, Ezra and Nehemiah, they're with the Jews in Israel. What they did is impacting world Jewry until today. You just keep that in mind when we're serving God and we're sincere and we don't see what we're accomplishing and we don't see we're the stars of the show and we don't see the success. But when you're serving God, it has eternal ramifications. It was a pretty quiet class, as I noticed these history classes are. Maybe because I just keep talking, so no one feels comfortable to interrupt. Please feel comfortable to interrupt. Anyone have any questions on anything I said? Okay, I guess not. We'll take it that it was clear. And thank you so much for joining. And if you do have any questions or something, you could always text or WhatsApp me, you know, because I do want to make sure the pace is right and the information is right and people really, you know, do feel that. Chava?
Yes, I want to ask for how long Ezra and Nehemiah were leaders of Jewish people?
That's a great question. They sort of continued their leadership until really this whole like intermediate time until we really see like the I don't know how to explain it, until we see like the next era starting. The next era is like after the passing of the last prophets. What, in other words, what we're soon going to discuss, which we don't have time for now, but obviously we'll start it next week, is what's called the Men of the Great Assembly. And this was a very special body of Torah scholars led by Ezra and Nehemiah. And they were the only great leaders in it. Mordecai was there, Daniel was there, the final prophets were there. So this was all in this like intermediate era until really the kingdom solidified as a kingdom with that king, which we'll discuss. But until that point, Ezra and Nehemiah were basically leading the Jews until their passing, and then we move into like the kings that took over, which again are kings of the house of David, but they were sort of on the side when Ezra and Nehemiah were leading. Remember the Zerubbabel, the first leader before Ezra, he was from the royal family of David. Then we have Ezra, and then we have Nehemiah. But then again, now when their rule is going to be like over with their passing, they didn't get to pose. With their passing, it's going to go back to being under the kings. So I don't remember exactly how many years it was, but I could probably figure that out. But they were really the ones that solidified the settlement in Israel. Now again, the settlement in Israel in the Second Temple was never as strong as by the First Temple because we never had the entirety of the Jewish people on it. As I'm saying, the majority were in Babylonia. So the settlement was always a little weak from that end because there's a certain spiritual strength in numbers. So when the numbers are smaller, also spiritually the energy is weaker. But still, this, as I said, the temple that they built lasted 420 years. So it was something that they were creating here that continued now for 420 years. Anyone else? Any other questions?
What happened to Sumerians?
That's a good question. What happened is, at a certain point, I probably should have, I just didn't finish off the story with them. I'm sorry. Thank you. So remember we said the Sumerians were upset with us from the start because they knew when we came in, they would sort of lose their control over Israel. When we were in Babylonia, they had the whole land. So we said the Sumerians first successfully got Ahasuerus to stop the building. But after that point, they kept on like trying to start up with us. They kept on trying to hurt us. But they also at the same time kept playing this dance of we're Jews too. You know, like on one hand, we're Jews. On one hand, we're trying to mess you over. On one hand, we're Jews. On one hand, we're trying to mess you over. So the Jewish people sort of always were very suspicious of these Jews, the Sumerians. And then the sages found out that even though they claimed to be Jews, they were still idol worshippers, meaning they never gave up their original Kuti religion that they came to Israel with. And the sages said, no, you are not Jews. You are not Jews. Because if in all these years you've still kept worshiping your original idols, you're not Jews. So we are cutting you off. From this point on, we have nothing to do with you. You're like any other Gentile nation. Once the sages said that, the Sumerians stopped having a significant voice in our history because they were cut out. We just said, you're not Jews, so you're no different than any other nation that sort of cheppers at us, that tries to hurt us. You know, you're just another little group of people. Now, at that time, the Sumerians had quite a large number, and they stayed in Israel. And gradually, over the hundreds and hundreds, really thousands of years since then, they've still stayed in Israel, and their numbers got fewer and fewer and fewer. Today, there are still people from those original Sumerians that live in Israel, and they still view themselves as quasi-Jews. And it's interesting because people that have studied them in modern times say they have a religion that has some aspects of it sort of like Judaism, and they have scrolls, you know, the scrolls of their Torah, whatever, that are sort of like Judaism, but not 100%. But today, these Sumerians, the ones that are still in Israel, don't view themselves as Jews. And the Jews in Israel don't view the Sumerians as Jews. So it's interesting that there's still a tiny remnant. I don't know if their community numbers 150 people, 200 people. I'm saying the entire nation. Very, very, very small, but they're still existent, and they're quite a backward nation. Meaning they haven't like modernized into the 21st century. They still have a lot of the tribal patterns of their ancestors. But it was interesting, you know, Menucha's question sort of raises an interesting point to see that until the sages said, you are not Jews, the Sumerians gave the Jews a lot of trouble because they seemed to be Jews, but they really weren't Jews. So they made trouble for the Jews, or they tried to intermarry with the Jews, and they caused us a lot of problems. Once the sages said, let's establish what's black and what's white. You are not Jews. Behu, that's it. You are not Jews. You are idol worshippers. You are not Jews. Then suddenly the whole hold on us, all the problems they gave us sort of fizzled away. They were nothing. They're not Jews. They're nothing. They had no power over us. So sometimes, you know, like in our reality, we like sometimes like try to dance around issues. We don't want to like go confrontational. We don't want to go head on, black, white. We like to like, you know, whatever, be good with everyone. So the sages could have continued that dance of like, yeah, we don't really trust you, but we're pretending you're Jews, but we don't really trust you, and you're giving us a lot of problems, but we're pretending you're Jews. And that created a lot of problems. But when the sages were like, you are not Jews, that's it, you are not Jews, then like, it made it actually much simpler. It actually made it a much, much simpler situation, and the problems they were giving us actually really, really stopped, because guess what? They're not Jews, so they didn't really have a hold over us. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you, Chava. Thank you, Menucha. Thank you for the people that joined Mila. It's so nice to see you. I'm glad you made it this week. And Chava, so nice. Your friends, Batsheva and Rachel, came again, and we appreciate that. Thank you for being good friends of Chava. So you come for the class, you come for Chava, whatever it is. We're very happy. You know, it's all good. And it's so nice, everyone that joined. And we should have a wonderful week, and really should speedily, speedily see Mashiach now. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sirla. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Stella. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.